Well, it's time to reassemble the diaphragm mechanism on this shutter. So I'm just assembling my bits and pieces here. And I'll start with my assembly jig. And my assembly jig is made up of two sockets with a wooden peg to keep them aligned together. Now the plate only goes on one way for our practical purposes. The up surface is the dead flat surface. That's the one the diaphragm blades run against. The surface we put to the bottom has got 5 little indentations in it at these points, and that's where the shutter blade pivots actually run. So those indentations go down. We want the flat surface to the top. And our blades. The blades are not symmetrical. The pivot, rivet, is closest to the edge on one end and closer to the middle on the other. And the pivot on closest to the middle goes down against the plate into these fixed points. And as I said, the blades are not dead flat because they've suffered a little bit of distortion, and so they don't lie as flat on the jig as I would like them to. That's not quite correct. See if I can lift that and move it. That's better. That sounded like the doorbell, but I know from experience that that's not the doorbell at all. That's just the doorbell going off at random to some random RF signal in the neighbourhood. And I can tell that because the doorbell is capable of making a variety of tunes. And that particular tune is not the sound it makes when someone presses the doorbell button at the back door. I've never discovered what it is in the neighbourhood that sets that thing off. I used to assume it was a passing taxi and it was their radio that was doing it, but these days I've got no idea. Perhaps it's someone's garage door opener, who would know? Now, we've got to the stage where there's only a couple more blades to go in, and obviously they have to go in underneath the existing blades. So I've got to pull the existing blades back out of the way, swing them back out of the way, to enable me to get these last two blades in place. Oh yeah, one more. It's got a little thread of cotton there from the cotton bud caught on that pivot. Just swing that out of the way. Right, that's all the blades in place. Now I've got to lift these back over the blades without disturbing anything. Swing them back into place. And now I have to get the case back over it. I'm just checking that I have the case set at the wide open or F2 end of the range and checking my alignment, and I'm watching that. On this plate there is 3 holes, screw mounting holes on the outside edge, and they fit against 3 points here in the case, so I can tell where they go, and I can just checking my alignment, make sure I know which thing goes where. I drop the case over, and I'm hoping to pick up that the slots in that ring drop in over the pins, and that seems to be the case. I felt them click. And turn my jig over. Now I can just see 1 or 2 pins that are not quite in place. I've got 3 screws that hold this plate down. I'm going to start the screws, but I won't do them down tight. Just want to get them in place to keep that plate loosely in position, because I'm going to have to manipulate those blades to make sure that their pivots are seated correctly. I already know at least one is out of position. I can probably deal with one. I can deal with a couple of blades being out of position, but if it gets up to about 3 or 4 of them out of position, then my chances of getting everything seated correctly start to diminish, and I would have to start the process of reassembling the diaphragm again. Since each attempt takes a few minutes, I don't want to do it any more often than I have to. Alright, so I'm looking at this, and one post there is not quite seated. Now it is. That just dropped down into position, and I'll just tighten my screws up just lightly, not tight, because I don't know for sure that the pins on the other face dropped into their slots correctly. I hope they did. Yeah, one just fell in then. I just felt it. There was a pronounced click as one of the blades dropped into position. Okay, so that's all good. Those diaphragm blades are in position, and the screws, 3 screws holding the cover plate in position, can be snugged down. Now there's some resistance on the setting lever, which is as it should be, otherwise it's very easily knocked and you'd lose your settings while you're trying to cock the shutter or adjust the focus. But I'm quite confident now that any resistance that I'm feeling is resistance between the setting lever here and the case, and that's intentional. It's just to provide a measured bit of friction there so that it stays where it's put. And f3.5 is at this setting, and you can see the size of the opening there. That all looks good to me. So our case is good. We can pop that to one side. I need to deal next with the mechanism plate. With the mechanism plate, there are two main functions I have to do. First is to make sure that all the surfaces are clean of any excess oil and grease. And the second one is to make sure that the retard gear train has been flushed and is free from dust and grit or any oil contaminants itself that might cause it to stick. Well, that cotton bud's quite stained, but it's a lot cleaner than I expected it to be after doing that, which shows that the dirt on that plate was very superficial and there wasn't an awful lot of oil on there. I just wipe around the edges of the mechanism plate and then clean the top surface. Being careful not to disturb or damage this spring here, which is the return spring for the lever that swings the shutter blade control ring backwards and forwards. Just swing that. All I did then was pull back the pallet, swing the arm on the retard gear train to the outside, release the pallet to hold it there so that I can get my cotton bud up that inside edge and clear that area of dried grease. Otherwise the arm here, you can see it swings back over to cover it. There's a little bit of dirt in the various crevices here and I'm just chasing that away. And on top of this retard gear train lever, there's some dried grease and dust accumulated there, and I'm making sure that's gone. So I'm quite happy I've got the bulk deposits of dust and dirt and grease and things off there, but I want to work this retard gear train with a bit of solvent on it to make sure that all the meeting surfaces are clear. And by rattling the gears backwards and forwards through their action like that, it just means you get a little bit of scrubbing action, if you like, on the teeth where they cross each other. And that helps loosen up any loose dust and contaminants. That all feels good. I'll blow that away. This shutter is, well, the whole camera looked like it had done very little in its life, and I suspect it probably was bought new in the 30s. Whoever bought it, for one reason or another, didn't continue using it. Perhaps they found it too complex for their photography, and I think it just sat out the next 50 years probably in the back of the dresser drawer. Certainly somewhere well protected. It's not all, the camera was not all scuffed up, so it means at least it was in a leather case protected. And it must have been somewhere nice and dry and at an even temperature, because it doesn't show the sorts of effects that I'm used to seeing from cameras that have been In damp conditions you would normally expect to see corrosion, and you would also, and in anywhere where the temperature cycles quite a bit, like out in the shed, anywhere like that, anywhere where it's warm in the day and very cold at night, the temperature cycling tends to lead to loose screws. And there was no problem with loose screws with this camera, I can tell you. Okay, so the mechanism plate there is basically cleaned up. So the blade actuating ring needs to be cleaned. And the retainer for the blade actuating ring. And there are 3 screws that hold the retaining ring in place. So these 3 components need to be cleaned. This has got quite a pronounced sort of dull grey appearance to it, and it just appears to be tried oil and dust really. It's coming away nicely, it's cleaning up. It's all shiny again as it should have been. I'm just inspecting that, looking at the surfaces. Bit of marking to the surfaces, like there's been a bit of friction there or something. And the retaining plate. One side of the retaining plate has 5 pins sticking up. They are pivots. They're the fixed pivot for the shutter blades. The other side of the plate, the underside here, it has a single post that just serves to align it in the case. And that cotton bud there is coming off quite well stained with the grease that was on there, and it was obviously, it's quite green. It reminds me of that awful green grease used on Agfa cameras in particular. They were always famous for the dreaded green grease. It's certainly some unusual mark on the plate at this point, and I can't tell whether it's a deposit or corrosion. Feels rough. It's some sort of deposit. It's polishing off with a end of a toothpick. Don't know what that is. Whether it's the lacquer that sometimes is the last remaining obvious component of oils when everything else is evaporated. You often get left with like a lacquer, and it may be something like that. And it's certainly cleaned away in the main part. A little bit here, I'll just see if that's going to come away. Nope, I think that's good. So, mechanism plate, blade actuating ring, which goes on there, the retaining plate, which goes on there, what does that not want to seat? Oh, that's that little setting lever here, the B, and the lever that opens the blades. I tend to forget about that because it's only present on the early shutters. That sits there. There are 3 screws retain this. One of them is a longer screw than the other 2. That's where a short one goes. That's where a short one goes. When you have a situation like this where you've got screws of varying lengths, if for example you had one long one and 2 short ones, you can always mark the position of where the long one goes with a scratch on the plate, just to make it obvious that's where the odd man out fits. You could do it with a pencil too. That scratches are more commonly used because they don't disappear in the cleaning process. You commonly find camera shutters and other parts of cameras where components have to be aligned and could possibly be put in more than one way, that previous repairers will have made a little scratch mark in places as a guide to putting pieces back in the correct position. It's less pressing these days when we've got digital cameras to help us. It's always good policy when you're taking apart some mechanism that you're not 100% familiar with to take lots and lots of photos all the way through the process so that you've got something to refer back to. It's not always the components that you're most aware of and have taken pictures of that'll get you in trouble. It'll be the components you overlooked at the time. But if you've got photos to compare with, you can usually dig yourself back out of trouble. Alright, so that's quite happy and that's moving nice and smoothly. So we've got the lever here and its retaining screw. The lever swings the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards, and as the blade actuating ring swings backwards and forwards, it swings the shutter blades in and out, since the blade actuating ring has the moving pivots on them. Alright, so that's quite good. Now this component, I normally put a little smear of molybdenum at its pivot and in that slot where it bears on the pin from the blade actuating ring. And you hardly need enough of that to make it look dirty, really. The molybdenum is a very good lubricant. Needs very little at all. Make sure that swings freely, and it does, and I'll hook its spring back into place. This action is very snappy. Once the blades have been cleaned, I can be quite confident that they will be just as snappy at dropping back into position as that lever swings through. So I want to check the action of the retard gear train. It's sun's coming round. Okay, this mechanism plate. Now I just want to check the action of my retard gear train here. Checking that it does run smoothly, and that looks good. Well, that mechanism plate's clean. I've lubricated it with a bit of graphite powder, which I've worked in and puffed away any excess. And I'm very happy with the action of the retard gear train, so we'll pop that to one side. And the next thing to deal with are the shutter blades themselves. And the shutter blades here are quite marked, quite stained with oil. And I don't know immediately whether they're going to clean up well with just a bit of solvent, or whether they're going to have to be polished. With Brasso is typically what I'd use to polish them. I dislike using it. Particularly with blades like this. These blades from the early shutters are reinforced. Where you see these bronze rivets here, they're holding a reinforcing plate on that shutter blade, and the reinforcing blade means that you would have effectively surfaces there that could trap polish. And you wouldn't want it coming out later. It would come out as probably a dry powder and very abrasive. I'm checking the state of these blades. That one cleaned up very well indeed. So I'm fairly confident that these will clean up well. As I said, it appears the camera had done very little work, and probably at the most would have had 2 or 3 films through it, even including the one the current owners put through before they sent the camera to me for service. It just appears like a new camera, particularly as far as wear surfaces are concerned. Little spot on the blade there, I'm not sure what that is. It's hard to get the light to just shine on the blade at the right angle. Just a little speck there that I'm making sure that it's an imperfection. If it's an imperfection and if it's a pit, that's fine. A pit won't rub on anything. If it was a bump would be a problem. That could rub on something. That's good. Alright, one last blade. At least the shutter blades will never have been handled in anyone's bare fingers, otherwise they would look very ugly very quickly in the piece, and people would pick up on that and take their camera back to the shop. Alright, so I'm looking at my blades, making sure that they are all symmetrical, they're the same, the reinforcing is all on the same side. With some shutters you may get one blade where the reinforcement's on the other side of the blade, and that would be a cue that that needs to be positioned in a particular place, either as the first blade or the last blade to be installed. So I unhook the spring and swing my blade actuating ring into the blade's open position, and my blade can start there. I just swing those blades in just very slightly so the case doesn't catch on a blade as I'm lifting it over the top. And now I've got to align my case correctly. So I'm looking for my screw holes. I've got 3 screw holes in this case, and they quite obviously go here, here and here. So if I lower the case over the top, align those 3 screw holes, make sure they're sitting correctly. I have 3 screws to hold the case. I only put those in loosely until I have all 3 in position. If you go mad and tighten up the first screw of the set, you may well find that there's a slight alignment problem somewhere and you'll be unable to get the 3rd one started. If you get them all started first and then tighten them up, you have no such problem. Alright, that appears good. Now see if the blades swing in correctly. They do. And let's see if the spring is sufficient to allow them to snap back into place, and they most certainly do. They're very good action. So I can tighten up those 3 case screws,